Hello everyone. So in this episode we will be implementing the player's melee attack system. So first let's start by creating an enemy. So I have here this sprite for an enemy in the game. You can download it from the link in the description below. So inside our sprites folder, we will create a new folder and I'll name it enemies. And we will drop the enemy sprite in. Then let's do the usual importing stuff. So let's slice it by cell count, and we have 2 rows and 2 columns. Let's also change the pivot to bottom and hit slice. So everything seems fine. Now let's apply. Now let's go to scripts and create a new folder here. So we'll call it enemies. And in here we will create a new C# script and we will name it enemy. Now inside the hierarchy, let's create a new game object. And we will name it enemy. Then let's add a sprite renderer component and select the enemy sprite. And we'll also need to add a rigid body 2D. And let's freeze rotation on Z. Then let's add a box collider 2D. And let's move our enemy just a bit, maybe like this. And lastly, let's add the enemy script we've just created. Then let's add a new layer for enemies. So add layer. We will call it enemy. And then change the enemies layer to enemy. And now from the project settings, physics 2D. So we want the enemy to collide with the ground and walls, but not with the player. Alright? Now let's open the enemy script in Visual Studio. So we get rid of start and update. And then let's sketch our components. So I'll add a header for the components. And so we have a rigid body 2D and a box collider. And we get them in the awake function. And box collider is equal to get component box collider 2D. Alright, so for now we just need the enemy to take damage when getting attacked by the player. So at the top here, let's create 2 variables. So the first one is going to be our max health. So private int max health, and I'll set it to 1. And the second one is the current health. And let's add serialized field to the max health so that we can change it in the inspector if we need to. So serialized field. And then in the start function, so when we start the game, we want to set the current health to the max health. And down here after start, let's create the function that we will use to deal damage to the enemy. So public void take damage. And it will take in an integer parameter for the damage amount, so damage. And all we have to do here is subtracting the damage amount from the current health, so current health minus equal damage. And after that we check if the current health is less than or equal to 0. This means the enemy is dead. So we can simply call a die function. And let's create it here. So later we will make the enemy play a death animation and fly away. But for now, let's just destroy the enemy's game object. So we write destroy game object. And there we go. So now let's save and back in Unity. Let's go to sprites, player. And here we have the attack sprite. So I'll drag it into the folder and start doing the usual importing stuff. So here we can slice it by cell size or cell count, it doesn't matter. So you have 3 columns and 4 rows. And we should not forget to change the pivot to bottom. Now let me rename them quickly. Okay, now we can apply. And let's click on the player renderer. and open the animation window. So we'll create a new clip for attacking. So let's go to animations, player, attack. Alright, and now we can start recording and insert keyframes. So now we have an attack animation. Next, let's go to the animator window. So we can see the attack animation here. So I'll make the transitions. So we will have transitions from idle and run to attack, and from attack back to idle and to run. Now let's add a new parameter. So I'll make it a trigger and name it attack. Then let's click on the transition from idle to attack. So no exit time, 0 for the transition duration. And for the condition, let's select attack. Now we can copy this and click on the transition from run to attack. Right click and paste both. And then to transition back to idle, we will wait until the entire animation plays, so we will keep as exit time checked. And we will set the exit time to 1, meaning that 100% of the animation has played. And the transition duration is going to be 0. And for the condition, let's transition when run is false. Now we can copy this to the other transition. And the only thing we will change is that run is true. Alright, so now that our animator is set, we can start adding the attack functionality. So let's go to the scripts folder. And then player. And let's create a new script. I'll name it PlayerAttack. And then open it up. So let's remove start and update. And at the top here, let's add a reference to our player controller. And let's also go to the player controller and add the PlayerAttack subscript. Alright, now let's go to the PlayerAttack script. And here we will add some variables. So first we will need a serialized field, transform for the attack point, then a vector2, private vector2 for the hitbox size, then 2 floats. The first is the attack start time. Let's just copy this line. And the second one is the attack end time. And finally, we need a boolean. So public bool named is attacking. Okay, that's all we need for now. Then inside update, we want to check if the attack key is pressed, and we still don't have a key for attacking. So let's go to the player input script. And here under keys, let's add a public key code. And I'll name it attack key. And set it equal to the J key. Now back in PlayerAttack, we check if the attack key is pressed. So if input.getKey down, player input.attack key. And here the first thing we want to do is playing the attack animation. So let's set the attack trigger by typing playerController.anim.setTrigger. And we set the attack trigger. Then we set is attacking to true. But we want to do that only when the player is not already attacking. So let's add another if statement. So if the player is not attacking, and we will put these 2 lines inside. After that, let's check if the player is attacking. So if is attacking, we want to call an attack function. But we don't want to be attacking throughout the entire animation. Instead, we want to attack only when the player swings his sword. So we will check if the animation normalized time, and we can get it from the animator .get state info, current state info 0 dot normalized time. So we want to check if it's greater than the attack start time. And let's copy this line. It should be less than the attack end time. So in this case, we want to attack. Okay, so now down here, let's add the attack function. So private void attack. And now we want to detect enemies inside our hitbox. So for that, we will use physics2d dot overlap box all, which is similar to the overlap box function we used in the last episode to detect collisions, except that overlap box returns a single collider, whereas overlap box all returns all the colliders that fall within the box area. And this makes more sense in our case, since we can hit multiple enemies at the same time. So let's pass the attack point dot position for the center, the hitbox size for the size, 0 for the angle, and we need a layer mask for the enemies. So let's go to the top and let's create serialized field, private layer mask, and I'll call it enemies layer. And then let's use it inside our function. So overlap box all returns an array of colliders. So let's create an array to store them. And I'll call it hit enemies. And then we want to check if we hit something. So if hit enemies dot length is greater than 0, meaning that we hit an enemy. So if that's true, we want to loop through all the enemies we hit. So for each collider 2D enemy in hit enemies. So in here we will damage all the enemies we hit. So let's type enemy dot get component. We want to get the enemy component. And then we will call the take damage function. And we will pass 1 for the damage amount. Alright, and now let's visualize our hitbox. So we can use draw gizmos. And we're gonna use gizmos dot draw wire cube. So we're gonna pass the attack point dot position as the center and the hitbox size for the size. And of course we want to do that only if the attack point exists. So if the attack point is null, we want to return out of the function. Alright, that's it. So now let's save and switch back to Unity. So let's add the PlayerAttack script to our player first. Then let's create an empty game object inside the player renderer for the attack point. And let's move it to the right place. Maybe here. Then we go to the PlayerAttack component. And let's drag the attack point and change the hitbox size. Maybe something like this. Then for the start time, I'll put 0.3, and for the end time, 0.9. And finally, let's select the enemy layer for the enemies layer. So if we hit play now and try to attack, we can see that we can attack only once, and that's because we haven't set isAttacking back to false. So let's fix this. So for that, we will use animation events. So animation events allow us to call functions in the game object scripts at a specified point in the animation's timeline. So let's start by creating a new C# script inside the player folder. So scripts, player, create C# script, and I'll name it animation events. And let's attach it to the player renderer. And that's because the script has to be attached to the same game object where the animator is. Alright, now let's open it up. And let's get rid of these. And then we'll create a reference to our player controller. So private player controller. And then in awake, let's set it equal to get component in parent. And we get the player controller. And that's because we have the player controller in the parent game object. So after that, we can create a public void, and I'll name it onAttackFinished. And here we just want to set isAttacking back to false when the attack is finished. So let's first check if player controller exists. So if it's null, we return. But otherwise, we want to get the PlayerAttack script, then isAttacking, and set it back to false. And that's all. So let's save and go back to Unity. So let's click on the player renderer, go to the animation window, and let's select the attack animation and move the cursor to the end. Now we can click on the pin icon, and now we can see this little white pin over the timeline. So we can click on it, and here we can select the function we want to call. So let's select on attack finished. That should do it. So let's hit play and test it. So I'll try to attack, and as you can see, it works as expected. So that's pretty much it for this one. In the next episode, we will be working on the player's health and damage detection. So if you think this video is useful, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn the notification on so you don't miss the new episodes. And as always, never forget to save your projects, and I'll see you next time.